Morning Year 12. Recently, I've asked you to take a look at the progress African Americans were making at the start of the 20th century. Now, in particular, I've asked you to consider how far their position advanced as a result of World War I, as well as looking at Marcus Garvey and the impact he had in the 1920s. Today, I'd like to recap on those issues before we move on to look at the Great Depression and the contribution made by FDR. Now, I'm putting our key question at the top of the screen so that we can keep it in mind throughout this video. Firstly then, it's perhaps important to consider the importance of World War I in allowing African Americans the opportunity to prove their worth as equal citizens of the USA. Over 350,000 black soldiers served in the US Army during the war. Now, the majority of these soldiers were prevented from playing an active role on the front line. Racist white attitudes of social Darwinism were prevalent amongst many whites who believed African Americans were incapable of making a useful contribution. Instead, the majority were used to dig latrines, those are the toilets used by soldiers in camps, or loading and unloading the supply ships. However, 40,000 African Americans did see active service and are recorded as having served with distinction. Now, of these, some of the most famous were the Harlem Hellfighters. It was from their ranks that there emerged the first two black soldiers to be awarded the French gallantry medal, the Croix de Guerre. Now, it was this contribution by black American soldiers that helped to underline why it was that they deserved to be seen as equal citizens of the USA. Economically, World War I was most significant as it heralded the start of the Great Migration, the phenomenon that saw the movement of millions of African Americans from the South to the North over the next 50 years. And during World War I, the demand for armaments created a demand for workers in areas such as the steelworks, the railroads, the meatpacking and the automobile industries. And many African Americans were eager to turn their backs on sharecropping in favour of the wages that factory work would bring. Now remember, World War I saw wages rise by 25%, making this a period of economic prosperity for those African Americans who had made the journey north. However, there would be serious short-term consequences for those same black Americans. The return of white soldiers at the end of the war saw them come into conflict with those African Americans who were seen as having taken their jobs in the factories. And this resulted in outbreaks of racially fueled violence. Now, it's worthwhile taking a look at the information below this video for a link to the story of the Tulsa race riots of 1921, as well as a great podcast that covers that particular story. It's a really interesting little period that until very recently hasn't really received much attention in American history, but it's one that's well worth taking a look at now. Another social change brought about by World War I occurred as a consequence of the Great Migration. African Americans migrated north, creating large communities in specific areas of cities such as Harlem. And these areas were frequently underfunded, and as a result, African Americans suffered from poor living conditions and inadequate schools. However, these ghettos also allowed African American culture to flourish. Harlem, New York City, is a great example of a place where black writers, painters, poets, and musicians such as Duke Ellington and Count Basie emerged. This was hugely significant as it allowed a sense of black identity distinct from white America to form and represent African Americans. This sense of culture and identity was important in giving early civil rights leaders, men such as Marcus Garvey, from Du Bois a foundation upon which they could build their arguments for black power and black pride. Politically, African Americans were able to make more progress at grassroots levels rather than at a federal level. Those black Americans who had migrated from the South to the North did benefit from the voting rights they enjoyed in the North, rights they had been previously denied in the South. And consequently, they were able to have a say in electing their own representatives onto local councils. However, this increased presence did alarm some northern whites who disliked the changes they were witnessing in their neighbourhoods. The black soldiers who travelled to Europe experienced life in countries where there was no segregation, and this pushed them to consider changes that could be made within the USA. However, at a federal level, the government was guided through World War I by Woodrow Wilson. Now, when you studied for your GCSEs, Wilson was largely seen as the idealist responsible for trying to ensure world peace through the establishment of the League of Nations. However, the dark side of Wilson was that he was a racist president who actively tried to hinder the progression of African Americans within the White House. He supported segregationist laws and set about dismissing African American civil servants. At a federal level, the black voice and input was diminished in political rights. So, overall, World War I does have an impact upon the progression African Americans are making at this time. However, it perhaps had a bigger impact economically than politically, as it is responsible for pulling many black Americans from the agricultural South to the industrial North, where they had a chance to earn better wages. And this also allowed for the growth in the sense of black identity, as a range of art, written, spoken and musical, emerged, and this was truly reflective of many black Americans for the first time. However, politically, there was little change to their rights. This hindrance lay in the fact that the president was hostile to their progress. Without strong, sympathetic support at the top, significant political progress would prove impossible. Okay, so as a takeaway from this lesson, here's what I'd like you to do next. I'd like you to take a look at the link to that article from The Atlantic that tells the story of the Tulsa race riots. I think it's a fascinating story, and one, like I said earlier, that was covered up for many, many years. It's only just really started to come out. At the same time, you can also maybe do a little bit more research of your own to understand what was the reaction to those African Americans who migrated from the South to the North. How were they received in northern cities? What examples are there of tensions that started to emerge between black and white Americans, perhaps more across America now that we're starting to see African Americans spread further north? Till next time, see you soon.